As you must be also aware, it's not exactly an official tool of the General Conference. It's not something that's been initiated by the General Conference, and it is not something that has been used broadly, although in the last few years quite a number of you, as well as a number of treasurers, have caught on to what this tool could mean for them. And as we were leading up to this advisory, I was asked by your new leader, Pastor Bomfim, to make a presentation to you, even though obviously you've heard about it, so that you may become perhaps better acquainted with it, even though, and this is something that I need to acknowledge right up front, I have not worked extensively on the Global Tithe Index over the last few years for a number of reasons, one being technical, due to the way that the Adventist Statistical Report is published now, and you may remember a couple of years ago they changed the rhythm of that publication and made it actually quite more cumbersome for anybody to start to correlate membership data with financial data, as they would be published at an interval of 6 to 12 months. And the other reason is that, quite frankly, over time, the exercise of preparing this index has become more and more demanding of my time and of my attention. When I started in 2002 or 2003, you know, I could whip that up in just a few hours, but over time it got more and more involved, and the analysis got more and more specific. And it would take me up to 50 hours to just have it ready for publication. Of course, I'm not talking about the statistics and the ratios themselves. I mean, that's something that I can put together in 5 hours, and you have actually the most recent one in your hands. But I'm talking about the report that goes with it, which every year then became a document of 50 to 70 pages. And it was the equivalent of producing a master's thesis every year on my own time. So having spent 8 years at Adventist Review and Adventist World, and a number of you know me in that capacity, you know that we were not idle there. And I appreciate Gimo Sung being here, because he was one of my counterparts in NSD, where they held the funds for us. And is this Thai? You're from the Philippines? No? Thai. Oh, sorry. Yeah, we met in your office in Taiwan, of course. Anyway, you know, my traveling and everything else was such that it was more and more difficult. And so if I'm talking this morning to you, it is about an instrument that is with numbers that may be a little bit dated, but nonetheless that may offer some insights, and perhaps may also create an interest on someone's part here to pick up the torch from me with my help, so that this analysis and this work may go forward. And maybe what I'm about to show you is going to inspire you in that direction. My computer just went to sleep on me, and hopefully it's not going to do this again. And hopefully I'm going to remember my my password. I'm going to have to sit now. Good. The way that I'm going to introduce this is by asking the question, what does the Global Tithe Index say about the church? Which, of course, is going to be perhaps the chief motivation that one can find in studying or even preparing this document. It started in my mind when I was the Associate Secretary of the East Central Africa Division in Nairobi, when I observed the difference of the way that people contributed their funds to the church from the background that I came from. I came from Switzerland via Canada, and you can readily, by those two pictures, see the difference. In one economy, it's kind of cash, and in another economy, it's a credit card, and now, of course, it's online. But more importantly, even, I asked myself the question as I was looking at the statistical report produced by the General Conference and seeing how in certain countries the tithe per capita per say in Africa was $10, and in other countries it was $1,000. Now, some of you know that Africa has in the past not enjoyed a very good reputation for faithfulness or for controls that would make sure that the money would actually be returned to the treasury. And I thought, is this true that Africans are less faithful than, let's say, Europeans or Americans? And of course, when you look at the numbers on their face value, $10 versus, say, $100 or $1,000 of return per capita, per member, you would say there's no way to judge unless we understand that those economies are different. So if we could capture the value of an economy to its inhabitants, to the people of that country, and put it into a formula, we may be able to create a much more level playing field. And this is how I came up with the idea of developing a formula which I called the Global Tithe Index, because that formula translates into a series of numbers which you can see on this sheet. And those are ratios, of course. And those ratios have to be understood in their context. But let me point to you that if you want to have more specific information, you can go to a website where the past reports have been uploaded. And specifically, I entered back in 2009, I think, into a partnership with IAS, where you can find the explanation of how the formula works and what this instrument is all about. Here, the introduction to this topic, it says the Global Tithe Index is an instrument that facilitates country-by-country comparisons of tithe returns on a basis that factors out the country's economic standard and therefore puts all countries on an equal footing. The instrument is described in greater detail on the next page with the formula that looks something like that. Now, I have never been a math genius. In fact, I flunked math miserably when I was in high school. It's one of the stories that I like to tell, but I won't do that today for lack of time, simply because it tells you that you can end up in another place in life, even though you may not be great at math. But at any rate, it puts into the equation the national statistics, meaning the gross domestic product per capita, into an equation that also takes into consideration the tithe per capita of any given country. And to make even the playing field more even, that's not for our purpose, but for the purpose of economic analysis, economists have developed the concept of purchasing power parity, meaning that they will compare countries not just on their values, economic values in raw dollars, but those dollars are weighted according to how much a dollar can buy in a given country. Okay? So this is, I would say, and admittedly, it is the most equitable, the most even way of comparing the output of countries around the world, and every economists will tell you that. So this is the instrument that I used, and I gleaned the numbers from the CIA World Factbook, which updates them every year and then makes also some adjustments, because not every year they get specific or precise statistics, but they can figure out the trends, and they have their own ways of making sure that those statistics are about right.
The tithe per capita, is that within our membership, our Adventist membership?
That is correct. That is within our membership. So I'm not going to bore you with the details of how this actually works, but more with really how to understand it as a tool, and how to also make caveats that help us to realize that just as with any tool, you have to put things into a certain perspective and create a framework of analysis which will take into account items or factors such as the one that you have here before you. The members, the Global Tithe Index will not work for you if the members do not represent a cross-section of the whole population, because the sampling of that country is too small. Let's take the example of Albania, which has about 600 or 700 members. That cross-section of our members does not represent a typical cross-section of the country, because the sample is too small. So I have eliminated constituencies where members would be less than 1,000. That's one example. Iceland is another example. Or also, we have to be careful where the members are found predominantly in lower classes rather than spread across the whole economic spectrum of activities in that country. In some countries, we know that members are predominantly women, and we know that women earn less and therefore do not represent a statistically significant factor for an equitable comparison, or they are found in rural areas, which is the case in many developing countries, or in countries where the church has grown very rapidly and members have not been fully discipled and taught the discipline of returning tithe faithfully. In some countries, particularly of the former Soviet bloc, members were predominantly found in lower social classes because the state had discriminated against them, and therefore they could not get into high-powered jobs and have incomes that would be in relationship to the overall population. So, what does actually the Global Tithe Index say? As you can see, the statistics go back to 2011, but they are very instructive in as much as it shows that overall, comparing the ratios for every country year after year, and as well as in the aggregate, I could spot an upward trend, meaning that theoretically, as the line moves up towards a theoretical value of 100%, which would mean that 100% of the potential tithes that can be earned and returned by members is indeed returned. Let me explain this to you. Let's say you have a church that returns 100% of tithe, and you can know that within this membership, their potential for earnings is, let's say, $100,000. Okay? You know your families, you know who they are, you know what they do, and you have a pretty good idea of how much they make, and therefore how much in the aggregate that church can return in tithe per year. Are we together so far? Okay. So if you have that ideal scenario, but instead of returning say $10,000, which is 10% of $100,000 of earning power, they return only $1,000. The ratio would then be 10%. and therefore would be fairly low on that scale. It means that the total potential that is unrealized is 90%. And so the numbers that you have before you on the sheets that have been distributed, they vary between less than 1% for India to more than 50% for Switzerland. Okay? So theoretically, what it says is that in Switzerland, the membership is more faithful than in India. Are we together? Now, of course, all of this, as I said, has to be put into a certain framework and a certain perspective. The church in Switzerland has probably a different demographic makeup than in India. And I'll get to these things in greater detail in a moment. But when I aggregated all the countries, and the index has about 103 countries, when I aggregate all these countries and create an average for all of them, then I got at the beginning of my analysis about 12 and some percent, and at the end of my analysis, it had passed the 16% mark. So in theory, it means that the church over the period of time of 10 years has actually improved its giving. And that's great news. Now, you know, the work that eventually consumed all my time was, as I said, not so much in creating those statistics as in explaining what could have happened in a country that went from, let's say, 15% to 30% all of a sudden, or vice versa, went from 15% to 5%. And I'll give you a few examples. You have the Global Tithe Index average ratio for the top 25 countries, meaning those countries that seem to have the greatest faithfulness. You can see that the line has also moved up in the last 10 years. So again, I think that we can take heart by saying that our members, by and large, through education, through discipleship, through your ministry, has improved. The usefulness of the Global Tithe Index is not just to look at individual countries. Actually, when you look at individual countries, you have to do the kind of more specific analysis which eventually produces a book like this. But rather, it's interesting to see how it evolves around over time. The trend line is what you want to be able to recognize. Are we going up? Are we plateauing? Or are we going down? Patterns and tendencies is what leaders of the church need to be able to recognize in order to correct the course. Let me also mention and show that when you look at certain countries in the same geographic area, countries that are presumably imbued with the same values, perhaps even the same language, you may also be able to recognize either differences or, on the contrary, similarities. Let's take the three countries that are in the heart of at the southern, southwestern tip of Russia, the small country of Moldova, the country of Ukraine, and the country of Romania. Anybody represents those countries here? You're from Ukraine? Romania. Oh, of course. Johan. Yeah, happy to see you. Ukraine there. Good. Those three countries admittedly have something in common. They have the same religious foundation. Orthodox Christianity. They also still fairly rural and marked by socialism. All three countries have gained their independence from the Soviet rule relatively recently, and therefore one can expect that their level of giving would be more or less the same. Now, as I said, it is difficult to compare a country with another one if you look at specifically at raw dollars. Here you see that it's fairly equal, But yet when you apply the ratio, you see that in principle, in theory rather, Moldova is twice as faithful as Ukraine. Moldova having 53% versus Ukraine 29%. That kind of, raises a flag. Could the church statistics be inflated perhaps by 45% in one country versus another, because sometimes the inflation of church statistics will depress the ratio. Oh, what is going on here? I'm going backward? No, I'm going forward. Romania seems to have about the same ratio as Ukraine, which I would have expected more or less. Those two countries being also having a large membership, a much larger membership than Moldova. And so I initially decided that the statistics in Ukraine and Romania were probably inflated. That is, that we have a lot of members on the books who are nominal Adventists, inactive, and have stopped returning tithe a long time ago. Mind you, when I actually made a trip to Moldova to put the question to the leadership there, could it be that the members in Moldova would be that much more faithful? And they actually confirmed that such was the case. They seem to have no problems in faithfulness, people returning tithe to the church. And another question that I had was, well, could it be possible that Moldova has exported a lot of members outside to Israel, to Romania, to Spain, because they speak Romanian, and that these people would return tithe to their own country? I mean, that was my assumption. And they said, no, as a matter of fact, it is not so. So this is probably a bona fide case of a church which is relatively faithful compared to other parts of the world, and perhaps even compared to its next door neighbors. Let me give you a few other examples. One of them I have already mentioned is the case of India. India has a ratio of less than 1%, meaning that out of 100 theoretical dollars of tithe that should be returned to the treasury, only 90 cents are in fact returned to the treasury. Now that's a rather startling statistics, and it deserves a little bit of attention. Now India, of course, has a workforce that is composed of people who make next to nothing in a day, but it also has this. And whoever has had the privilege of traveling to India knows that there are teeming masses that do actually work. They take the subway or the train every day, as these young people do, and then they return in the evening. So could there be a problem in India? At the very least, one can say, and this is one value that the Global Tithe Index delivers to church leaders, it is that India can be identified as a country where membership is inflated, and even vastly so. Have I kicked a sacred cow here? Director of Stewardship. You got your work cut out for you there. And I can talk at length with you, because I've also analyzed where the church is in India. It's mainly in Andhra Pradesh, and Andhra Pradesh is a very poor part of India. But Andhra Pradesh is also the heart of the Indian Silicon Valley. And we do have a lot of young people who have migrated to find jobs in Bangalore and in high-powered software companies, where they make a lot of money. So what is happening there? We can talk more, but let's take the other example, that of South Korea, and you'll forgive me for that, but I have permission to say what I'm going to say. South Korea is, in my opinion, is one country where the church is very strong. I've visited South Korea like probably 10 times. I have been privileged to visit its institutions. They are first class. Its members are committed. They are, you know, they're on fire for the Lord. They're missionary minded and all of that. But how is it that the GTI is less than 10%? Exactly, membership inflation. I put the question, this is a picture of Seoul, by the way, which is a sprawling metropolis. I put the question to Brother P.D. Chun. Now, P.D. Chun is the dean of the church in South Korea. He is somebody that people revere. And I thought, you know, if somebody is going to tell me the truth and can tell me the truth about the church in Korea, it is P.D. Chun. So I put the question to him, is there any chance, perhaps, that my analysis would show that membership in South Korea is inflated? And he said to me, and that kind of shocked me, he said to me, Pastor Richli, you know, we've talked about this at length at the division. And we estimate that the membership that is committed in South Korea is only about 70,000 out of the 225,000 that it had on the books. You accept that? Thank you, sir. So, you know, this is the kind of interesting things that I thought came out of this analysis. It shows how countries actually lag behind in the discipline of keeping their books, their membership records clean and updated. You can compare South Korea in terms of its economy with Italy. Italy has a church that is smaller in size, but its economy is very much on par with South Korea, and yet you can see that the GTI there is 0.29. So their membership records are cleaner, and it is also likely that perhaps there is a more regular habit of giving than by the average member in South Korea. Another thing that it shows that was fascinating to find is that the GTI demonstrates the power of solid leadership. And here, the picture child, the poster child, is your country. Brazil has changed from a country that was really at the bottom of the pile. It used to return less than $7.8 out of 100 potential tithe dollars. But here in 2006 or 7, something happened. You see that? The curve starts to go up. And I am very confident that this is the reflection of new leadership coming into the church, and specifically at the division, to begin with at the division in 2007. In fact, interestingly enough, just a couple of days ago, I was sitting in another advisory showing another curve from Brazil doing exactly the same thing, going from flat to growing significantly starting in 2007. There's no mystery. So you're coming from a good country. Now, you know, a few years have gone by, and this is the latest curve. The curve in blue is for Brazil. And you see that starting in about a couple of years ago, it started to stagnate and just even slightly decline. Now, I'm not sure what the reasons are, but that would be part of the investigation that I would conduct if I were to write a master's thesis again. And I suspect that some exchange rate fluctuations are playing a part because the currency suddenly started to drop in value against the dollar. And the economy also went a bit into a tailspin. So all of these things have to be factored in to really understand what's going on. Are we together so far, or am I putting you to sleep? What?
Interesting.
Okay. Before I give you, how much time do I have?
Possibly another 10 minutes max.
Yeah, 10 minutes fine.
People to get down to the
Exactly, exactly, exactly.
Go ahead.
You didn't describe about family units or earning people, like were there two earners in one family and that kind of thing? Or?
No, I don't factor that in for the simple reason that the gross domestic product statistics do not factor that in either. I mean, it's a ratio, it's a number rather that is divided equally among every head in a country, regardless whether they are earning money or not. Yeah. All right. So, in fact, this is what I was anticipating back in 2011. The blue curve being Brazil, and reaching the level of the United States by 2015. That is, this is perhaps not likely to happen now. I don't know what the latest tithe returns are for Brazil. But it looked very, very promising, and for me, definitely a pointer towards strong leadership. Another country that I can point to strong leadership is the country of Togo, but for different reasons. You see the curve here went from flat, and it was in the 7 to 8% range, and all of a sudden it jumped to 41%. And I went like, what's going on there? So I communicated with the treasurer of the West Central Africa division, and he told me that in Togo they had decided to clean their membership statistics. And they were very focused in that exercise. From one year to the next, they went from 11,000, I think, to 4,000 members. I mean, boom, like that. I've seen this pattern also in Bolivia, where from one year to the next, they went from 180 to 90,000 members. And then the next year, they cut another 20,000 members. You have to have guts to do that. But indeed, you know, the statistics that I've showed you manifestly points to the fact that there is a vast number of people who have kind of disappeared or become completely disenfranchised from the church. I'll take the last 5 to 7 minutes to talk to you about what does the Global Tithe Index say about the church in America, because this is fascinating. And I'll go very quickly over this and show you a graph which I developed when I thought, you know, America is a unique case because I can trace the global tithe index without distortions due to currency exchange factors. So I ask myself, given the fact that I can get a pretty good idea of what is going on in America, and America is the world champion in keeping statistics especially of an economic nature, what happened over the last 100 years? And lo and behold, you know, I've noticed that the curve was going up and down in the first 40 years until 1955, where it reached a peak of 51% and then went like without even one reprieve. I've discussed it with John at length, and I think it's even become a topic of discussion at some point with your administration, right?
Yeah, it's coming tomorrow.
What happened? Why? You know, it's like going over the cliff at the Niagara Falls. So I had to hypothesize, and I asked myself, what happened in the mid-50s that could have changed things so dramatically? Because this is not just, you know, a random event. It's a paradigm shift. And I asked myself, could it be that at that time, the advent of the consumer society really took hold, and this was characterized by 3 components. The first one is that television sets reached critical mass in 1955. Here's what I found. The penetration of TV sets in households reached critical mass with 64%, and then, you know, eventually plateaued. Now, of course, why would a TV set make a difference in the ways that we return our tithe? It's not so much the TV set per se, but rather what you see on the TV set. And TV in America, unlike in other countries of the world, TV is driven by advertising and by a crass culture of materialism and consumerism. Do we hear each other? Now, you know, again, if this was the only factor, I would still doubt that it could have had such an influence on our level of tithe giving in America. But those of us who are old enough to remember, you know, the 50s, 60s, going into the 70s, remember that there were a couple of other factors that enhanced and in fact magnified the impact of TV on society. And here you have some TV consumption hours, which show the difference in the number of hours. And I'm not going to go into the details, but rather point to you to the second factor, which is the arrival of large-scale shopping malls. Obviously, you know, what you advertise on TV, it has to be available somewhere. And in the 50s, you started, in fact, 1956, you had the construction of the first big shopping mall in America. And then from that time on, by 1960, there were 4,500 malls accounting for 14% of retail sales, and that jumped to 16,400 shopping malls in 1975. I mean, you know, now people had something else to think about, what to do with their money. They were enticed by advertising to go and shop. The third factor was that in the late 50s to early 60s, it was the advent of the credit society. The first credit card appeared in the early 50s, but it was kind of a niche product. But at the beginning of the 60s, it became a mass product. It was advertised, it was pushed down the consumers' mailboxes at a dizzying pace. Here you have some statistics that show how households are indebted to credit cards. And I liked the point that Ed made earlier on. I mean, debt is the slavery of the free. And in my opinion, in this country that has boasted to be the land of the free, there is not another country on earth where people are as enslaved as they are here. I mean, you know, those chains are made out of plastic. But they have a way to warp the mind and to say, okay, what am I going to give my money for? Am I going to return tithe first, or am I going to pay the bank first, where I have an average of $10,000 worth of credit card debt? You see, so those three factors, in my opinion, have been conspiring against our members, our Seventh-day Adventist members, to make them less and less faithful over time on a gradual basis. And I can compare the US with Canada, where the trend is not as strong. In fact, it is the opposite. Canada has another ethos of consumption, including another ethos of watching TV. And there are things there that cannot be compared with the US. Of course, those three factors that I've pointed out have been then exacerbated over time by other components, such as the change of demographics in the church caused by massive influx of immigrants from Central America and from other places. And we can talk about other factors as well. But it is my hypothesis, and until I'm proven wrong, you know, this is what will hold in my mind, that we are looking here at a crass example of what the culture of consumerism and materialism has done to the church by robbing it of billions of dollars of tithe over the last 50 years that should have gone into the Lord's work. I think I can leave it here, and I want to thank you very much for your kind attention. Again, if there is anybody who, you know, feels inspired to take up this work, I would be very happy to pass on the baton, work with you, to, you know, get you in on the saddle, so that if it proves to be of any value to you, this analysis may continue in the future. Thank you again very much.